Critic seems to have become a bad word. I don't think this is a good development at all. In fact, I think it's bloody horrible. If I'm saying that I'm being critical about something, it's mostly taken to mean that I'm bad-mouthing it, or at least that I'm not liking it, even if I'm just trying to say that I'm looking at it, well, critically. This came to me when I was working on my first video earlier this month about why I think that the movie version of The Never-Ending Story doesn't really work for me. While the video is called My Problem with the Never-Ending Story because it's mostly about just that, I've tried to stay fair. Listening back to what I've said, there are actually a lot of things that I mentioned that I like about that adaptation, a few of which I didn't actively think about before I started working on that script. What I knew before is that if you talk about a piece of media that you like, you will most likely find some things that bother you about it. But now I learned that the opposite is also true. Mostly I criticize for myself, trying to understand my opinion, but also to get other people thinking and to start a discussion. If you have an opinion completely different from mine, I'd love to hear it just as much as I love to hear somebody tell me that they think I'm completely right. But enough about me. Let's look at two very different critics who are active on YouTube. Both are great critics in their own right, and they make a good contrast on how you can go about that profession in two wildly different ways. The first of those two is Anthony Fantano. Since 2007, he has been writing music reviews on his blog The Needle Drop, before moving to YouTube 2 years later under the same name. In the years since, he has become one of the internet's biggest authorities on music. The second critic is Anita Sarkeesian, the founder of Feminist Frequency. She also started with YouTube in 2009, but really blew up in 2012. That year, her project Tropes vs. Women in Video Games was crowdfunded and launched. The news coverage of this crowdfunding led to a violent backlash in the form of an harassment campaign. I don't want to get into any detail about all that jazz, because I want to focus on Sarkeesian as a critic, not a victim. However, I thought I should at least mention it in passing, so it doesn't seem like I am ignoring this series of unfortunate events. Now let's talk about the differences between our two critics. I'm gonna get the most obvious out of the way first. Fantano is all about music, while Sarkeesian mostly talks about video games. While this seems like the biggest difference between the two, to me, it's really not. To me, their difference isn't what they are talking about, but how they are talking about it. For this, I'm gonna take a look at the biggest projects of both of them. For Fantano, that are his album reviews. And for Sarkeesian, it's her aforementioned series Tropes vs. Women in Video Games. Apart from being about two different kinds of media, these two shows are wildly different. Let's take a look at how Fantano and Sarkeesian structure their videos. At the beginning, both introduce their audience to what they are talking about. Here we can spot the first difference. While Fantano talks about one album per video, Sarkeesian talks about a whole bunch of different video games every time. The Needle Drop album reviews beginning is a quick rundown of the band's or artist's career up until this project that Fantano is talking about, while each episode of Tropes vs. Women in Video Games begins with a rundown of the trope that it's about. Although this is a big difference in subject, it's also a likeness in form. Both Fantano and Sarkeesian make it very easy for people to understand what they are talking about by providing the basic information about their topic before getting into the nitty-gritty. No matter if it's Fantano judging an album or Sarkeesian explaining why she thinks that an aspect of video games is problematic, it's safe to assume that most people who watch their videos aren't in fact the people who create the albums and video games. So if the people being criticized aren't us, why should we listen to those two and their like? To me at least, it's so I can see someone else's viewpoint on media. There are, of course, other reasons to listen to critics, the biggest of which is the recommendations you can get from them, but I want to highlight this one point today. I often check out a review by Fantano of an album that I already made my mind up about and just listen to what he has to say about it, compare my views to his, and more often than not, find myself disagreeing with him, while I still see where he's coming from with his opinion. With Sarkeesian, it's a bit different. In her main series, she always discusses more than one piece of media, so it's next to impossible for me to be familiar with everything she discusses. Her point, however, is that those problems can be found in a lot of games. As someone who's not that familiar with video games and not much of a feminist, much of what she says are completely new insights to me. Without her, I wouldn't think that deeply about video games, let alone with her feminist lenses on. While I find myself thinking that she's overreacting to a few examples of the trope that she chooses, until now, I've always agreed with her overall point. People like Fantano and Sarkeesian provide a great example on how to engage with media, staying positive while calling out any attempt of the media producers to sell us rubbish. Within their respective fields, they are more well respected than you might expect. If you work on producing any sort of media, you want to see it move forward, and being criticized does that. It's always just a tiny step, but a step forward nonetheless. If the fans of whatever the critics are talking about keep shouting them down instead of taking their example, the fans stop the media dead in its tracks. The irony behind that is that in their quest to defend the media they love, they hurt not only the critics, but the media itself. I personally try to take their example, obviously not in just adapting their opinions, but their approach at how they look at media. They take it seriously and hold it to high standards, while still seeing the positive aspects. Not only do I try to follow their example, I hope that more people do so. I encourage everyone to check out their work and follow in their footsteps in some way. As for myself, I will do that with my second episode of My Problem With very soon, and with thinking critically about media in general. I still feel kinda silly about begging people to like, share, subscribe and so on, but I have to do it, don't I? Anyway, I'll see you around next week on here, and on Twitter and Facebook whenever I feel like it. If you don't hear from me until then, I wish you a wonderful start of the year 2017.